Tache, reclamo ateo. Las condenas a Asherah fueron agregadas por los redactores deuteronomistas en tiempos de Josías. Antes de eso, Asherah era parte aceptada del culto israelita original. Marca de selección, refutación histórico-bíblica y arqueológica. 1. Todas las inscripciones de Yahweh y su Asherah son del siglo 8 a.C. Sitios como Kuntillet Ahrud y Kirbet el-Com tienen inscripciones que mencionan YHWH y su Asherah. Todas datan del siglo 8 a.C., no del período patriarcal ni del reinado de David o Salomón. Esto coincide exactamente con el período de apostasía denunciada por los profetas como Oseas, Isaías, Elías y Amós. Marca de selección, prueba interna, la Biblia, y externa, arqueología, coinciden en denunciar idolatría en ese periodo. 2. Los profetas contemporáneos a esas inscripciones condenan con fuerza la idolatría. Oseas, capítulo 4, 13, y Isaías, capítulo 1-2, 44. Denuncian el sincretismo con deidades como Baal y Asherah. Elías confronta directamente el culto a Baal y Asherah, 1 Reyes 18 y 19. No hay forma razonable de afirmar que estas denuncias fueran añadidas 100 años después. Los profetas vivieron y escribieron durante el auge del culto a Asherah, como lo muestran las inscripciones. Marca de selección, las condenas son contemporáneas a la idolatría, no añadidas después. 3. Si Asherah era parte legítima del culto a Yahweh desde tiempos antiguos, ¿por qué no hay ni una inscripción anterior al siglo 8 a.C.? Nada sobre Asherah ha sido hallado de los siglos X y AC, época de David, Salomón, o los jueces más antiguos. Si el culto a Asherah fuera normativo y solo fuera editado siglos después, debería haber evidencia de esa práctica desde mucho antes. Reverso de la mano con el índice apuntando hacia la derecha. Pero no existe marca de selección. Eso demuestra que el culto a Asherah fue una corrupción tardía, no parte original del yavismo. 4. Los textos bíblicos ya condenan a Asherah antes de Josías. Reyes como Asa, 1 Reyes 15 y 13, Jehú, 2 Reyes 10, y Ezequías, 2 Reyes 18. Combatieron el culto a Asherah y Baal mucho antes de Josías, y los deuteronomistas realmente insertaron todo en la época de Josías. ¿Por qué no simplemente callaron el fracaso de reyes anteriores como Ezequías, Asa o incluso Salomón? Marca de selección, la Biblia no embellece a sus personajes ni a su historia, y condena los errores reales de Israel a lo largo del tiempo. Eso no es propaganda ni edición tardía, es testimonio honesto. Los hallazgos arqueológicos noroeste contradicen la Biblia, sino que la confirman. Las inscripciones de Kuntillet Ahrud y Kirbet el-Com, del siglo 8 a.C., mencionan a Yahweh y su Asherah, que demuestran que había sincretismo idolátrico en ese tiempo, no que era culto legítimo, justamente lo que denuncian los profetas. Marca de selección, la arqueología respalda la narrativa bíblica, el pueblo cayó en apostasía. 4. La Biblia no oculta ni embellece la idolatría antigua. Salomón, figura central de la monarquía unificada, es acusado de adorar a dioses paganos, incluyendo Astarte, otra forma de Asherah, 1 Reyes 11, 5. Jeroboam es criticado por introducir becerros de oro, 1 Reyes 12 y 28-33, incluso Ezequías y Josías, reyes piadosos, son presentados como reformadores de un culto que estaba corrompido desde generaciones anteriores. Reverso de la mano con el índice apuntando hacia la derecha. Si la historia fuera reescrita para hacer ver mal a los anteriores, habría más distorsiones. Pero el relato bíblico muestra con brutal honestidad incluso los pecados de los héroes nacionales. Los expertos en crítica textual bíblica como Emmanuel Todd, Richard Hess o William Schniedewind han examinado los textos masoréticos y los manuscritos del Mar Muerto. Hasta la fecha, Tache, no existe ninguna evidencia textual temprana que muestre estos pasajes sin las condenas a Asherah. Ningún manuscrito antiguo, ni hebreo ni griego, ofrece versiones anteriores más positivas hacia Asherah. Reverso de la mano con el índice apuntando hacia la derecha. Si se tratara de añadidos tardíos, esperaríamos encontrar alguna variante antigua sin la condena, lo cual no ocurre. La teología bíblica nunca presenta a Asherah como adoración legítima. Incluso en tiempos de Salomón o Roboam, los textos son críticos de la idolatría, y Asherah siempre aparece como símbolo de desviación religiosa. 1 Reyes 14 y 23, época de Roboam. Se edificaron lugares altos, y también imágenes de ídolos de Asherah en todo collado alto. La narrativa no embellece a Salomón, Roboam ni otros. Los muestra como responsables de introducir cultos ajenos, lo cual confirma la coherencia ideológica antigua y no una supuesta agenda editada tardíamente. Si los supuestos deuteronomistas hubieran querido reescribir la historia para que se vea más pura y hacer parecer ilegítima la adoración a Asherah, entonces no habrían incluido fallas graves de sus propios héroes, pero lo hacen. David, adulterio y asesinato, 2 Samuel 11, Salomón, idolatría por influencia de mujeres extranjeras, 1 Reyes 11, 4 a 6, Ezequías y Josías, aunque son elogiados, no eliminan del todo la idolatría, 2 Reyes 23 y 24. Reverso de la mano con el índice apuntando hacia la derecha. ¿Qué tipo de escribas manipuladores preservan las derrotas, los pecados, las divisiones y los fracasos de sus héroes, si su objetivo fuera imponer una nueva teología? La transparencia brutal del texto bíblico indica que no fue editado para fines propagandísticos, sino que preserva una historia honesta y autocrítica. De nuevo, los restos de culto a Asherah en Israel como Kuntillet Ahrud y Kirbet el-Com, datan del siglo VIII a.C. Precisamente cuando los profetas ya denuncian esa idolatría, señal de advertencia. No existen inscripciones arqueológicas de culto a Asherah en tiempos de Moisés, David ni Salomón. Si esa adoración hubiese sido central o legítima, deberíamos encontrar pruebas de ella en siglos anteriores. No las hay. Reverso de la mano con el índice apuntando hacia la derecha. Eso encaja perfectamente con la narrativa bíblica. El culto a Asherah fue una apostasía surgida en el periodo monárquico intermedio, no una costumbre sagrada borrada por deuteronomistas. Uno de los mayores expertos en crítica textual del Antiguo Testamento, especializado en los rollos del Mar Muerto y la Septuaginta rombo pequeño azul, en Textual Criticism of the Hebrew Bible, Top analiza múltiples variantes textuales, y no registra ninguna interpolación reconocida que afecte 1 Reyes, 2 Reyes ni Crónicas en los pasajes que mencionan a Asherah. Libro. Top dice, no se ha encontrado evidencia concluyente de interpolaciones teológicas tardías sistemáticas que alteren ideológicamente los relatos históricos de reyes. La mayoría de las variantes son ortográficas o menores. Top, 2012, página 171. Marca de selección. Esto implica que los textos que contienen las condenas a Asherah ya estaban presentes en versiones tempranas y no fueron añadidas siglos después por deuteronomistas.
The idea that Yahweh had a wife, Asherah, dates back to ancient Canaanite religion.
Yep, that's true.
Inscriptions from the 8th century BCE found in Israel mention Yahweh and his Asherah, implying that there is a divine partnership.
Yes, but that doesn't mean the biblical idea of God, that he was a unique creator without partner, was not a competing belief. If the biblical narrative is true, we should expect to find inscriptions like this, because the biblical authors constantly told us many Israelites were worshiping other gods alongside the Lord. This tells us that if the biblical narrative is true, we should expect to find multiple views about the God of Israel in their pre-exilic time period. The biblical authors just interpreted these other views as sinful and rebellious. We could compare this to the 2nd century AD, where various Gnostic groups sprang up and had different views about who Jesus Christ was. But the mere existence of different theological ideas about Jesus doesn't mean the orthodox position didn't exist or only came later. Likewise, Christians can accept that in ancient Israel there was another theological view that God had a wife without it threatening the biblical position.
Over time, Yahweh absorbed the roles of the Canaanite supreme deity El, evolving out of this pantheon, this divine assembly, which was also called sons of God, to eventually become the sole God.
This is not a fact. This is a scholarly reconstruction of what could have happened, but we have no texts from ancient Israel that confirm this hypothesis. Given some of the biblical data, like Numbers 23, I think it's far more likely that the Lord was just understood as another name for El in Israel's early time period.
But through that transition, he took on the roles, the qualities of other gods, not just El, but also Baal. And there are many scholars, there's lots of academics that support this idea that a lot of the poetry for Yahweh came from the Baalistic literature.
Yes, I fully agree. We see this type of cultic competition throughout the Bible. Oh, you think it's Baal that rides the clouds? Actually, it's our God that rides the clouds. We can see similar practices in the New Testament, like Acts 17, where Paul took what the Stoic poet Aratus said about his pantheistic God and applied those words to the God of Israel. But this doesn't mean the God of the Bible absorbed the attributes of the Stoic God, and likewise the existence of cultic competition in the Old Testament doesn't necessarily mean that is what happened there either.
If what Christians had was faith, they would have no problem acknowledging this information.
I fully acknowledge the belief that God had a wife existed in the ancient world, but that doesn't mean we need to accept it as part of the biblical worldview. Just like the mere existence of Gnostic texts doesn't mean we need to rework our view of Jesus to include that theological perspective.
Taking some self-reflection time and realizing that Christianity has polytheistic roots.
Again, that is not a fact. That is one scholarly reconstruction of what could have happened, but I would cite a lot of evidence to the contrary.
But indoctrination will not allow them to see that.
Saying that Christians don't believe the way you do because of indoctrination is a cheap way to dismiss the arguments of your ideological opponents. I could just say the same thing about you, but that really gets us nowhere.
Jesus is supposedly a son of God, yet now they elevate him to authority above Yahweh.
No, we do not, because we affirm the doctrine of the Trinity. Jesus is also God. They are three in one.
So who are they to call anybody out their name or turn their nose up at worship of Asherah when they themselves do exactly the same thing?
The doctrine of the Trinity is not the same as saying that God has a wife, because that would be worshiping two gods, and we only worship one who is three persons. The reason why we reject Asherah worship is because it goes against biblical theology.
Claim that the worshippers of Asherah and the composers of these texts that link Asherah and Adonai disagreed with biblical theology requires a specific scholarly reconstruction / hypothesis / theory regarding the dating of these texts, and particularly one that does not enjoy widespread support. It is the minority view. It's not the consensus view among scholars.
I fully acknowledge that, but I still will promote the minority position because I think they offer far better evidence for their case than the majority position. And in many ways, their arguments have not been dealt with. Joshua Berman gives a good example in chapter 13 of his book.
But that's not how you presented it. This is how you presented it.
What actually happened was in Israel's pre-exilic times, some Israelites disagreed with biblical theology and thought God had a consort named Asherah.
So you spoke of a scholarly theory that is a minority theory among scholars as if it was what actually happened.
So let's try to put this in context. I was responding to someone else who said the God of the Old Testament had a wife, and my response was to point out what the Bible actually teaches. What the biblical texts actually teach is those who thought God should have a wife were acting in rebellion within ancient Israel. Now, maybe I didn't word that properly. I can accept that because it's always hard to try to figure out how to word what you're thinking. But again, I was responding to someone who said the God of the Old Testament had a wife. And my point is what actually happens in the biblical text is that idea was considered an act of rebellion. Richard Elliott Friedman, for example, assigns these verses to J and E. This would indicate early in Israel's history they were prohibited from worshiping any other god, including Asherah.
So I have three main concerns with this point. The first is that the existence of J and E as documentary sources is not even a given anymore.
As I'm sure you're aware, I fully agree. I was not advocating that J and E actually existed.
Second concern is that even among those who accept J and E as documentary sources, I would say the majority of scholars date Exodus 34 to the exilic period or after. Exodus 23 verse 13 has been argued to be a gloss by more than a few scholars, although that is more disputed than Exodus 34.
Again, I would like to see sufficient evidence that these monolatrist verses are actually later glosses, especially since there has been evidence presented that these are part of early texts. And I will remind my followers what Richard Hess warned. There is the inevitable special pleading for late dating the inconvenient biblical text that suggests otherwise.
Third main concern is that we have no data that indicate that this legislation, even if it existed in the 8th or the 7th century BCE, was widely known, much less enforced. In fact, the scholarly consensus is moving in the direction of recognizing that the Torah was not actually publicized, not widely known, not widely enforced until around the 2nd century BCE.
And if the biblical account is true, we should expect in the 8th century BC that the Torah was not widely known about. As they reported, this is what happened in this time period. I would also recommend this book for evidence on the early dating of the Pentateuch, with special attention to chapter 13.
I pretty explicitly stated the claim in the clip right before. Here it is again. I would argue that we cannot confidently identify any references to Asherah whatsoever, much less negative references to Asherah in any literature that predates the Deuteronomistic literature.
And I don't think sufficient evidence has been given to claim that these verses are later glosses and do not come from the times they purport. I encourage everyone to apply the principle of charity when it comes to these types of issues.
In fact, there are a lot of scholars who have argued quite forcefully that both Micah 1:7 and Micah 5:13-14 are later Deuteronomistic additions.
And with all due respect, having seen their arguments, I see no reason to see this as anything other than what Richard Hess or George Fisher warned about.
And my point is not that there are no rival hypotheses that exist. My point is exactly what I stated. We can't confidently date any condemnations of Asherah to prior to the Deuteronomistic literature.
And I would say if we keep following that line of reasoning, we can't confidently say anything about the status of Asherah in the hill country of Israel in the 8th century BC. Exodus 34:13 is consistent with its context. Notice the following verse calls for Israel to only worship one God.
Again, the majority view is that the ritual decalogue is a later text.
I'm fully aware, but I don't think they've made a good case for that. We don't have to just fall in line with whatever the majority position is. We're allowed to study the evidence for ourselves and go in the direction that we think is best. And disallow rhetorical and hortatory contact with the rest of the passage, lest it contaminate that source's hypothesized ideological purity.
So this reductively and pejoratively misrepresents the source critical enterprise, just so that it can be more easily dismissed.
I don't think that's a fair characterization of Joshua Berman's detailed critique of source criticism on the flood account, and I encourage everyone to read his book so you can see why he arrives at this conclusion. He's not just being dismissive.